Hello, and welcome to the 13 Horrifically Silly Days of Halloween blog series. I am Reagan, as you know, and today's guest is JF Garrard, a horror/fantasy author right here in Toronto. So please introduce yourself further if you would.
Hi, my name is JF Garrard, and I am a publisher, editor, writer, and podcast host of the Artsy Raven, which is a podcast about writing and publishing. So for publishing, I run an indie publishing house called Dark Heel Express in Toronto,
Oh, nice.
and that started a few years ago. So I publish other people as well as myself. So this whole thing started because I really wanted to be a writer when I was younger, but my tiger mom said absolutely not. So I went on this journey, and then I finished the East Meets West vampire book, and I couldn't find a publisher. So I ended up doing a Kickstarter, and then it was successful. So I opened up a publishing house to help other people.
Awesome.
So over time, I've also done a lot of volunteer work with the Canadian Authors Association and for Rice Paper Magazine in Vancouver. And then people started to ask me to do some editing work because I guess they couldn't find anyone else. So I was like, okay, fine. So I learned about editing and I put together a couple of anthologies. So that's been fun. And I still write. I think some of my friends worry about me because they're like, you do so many things, but you're not writing. And I was like, I'm trying, but yeah, it's true. I think I have a bit of ADD actually. I jump from project to project and but writing is my primary goal. So I'm slowly getting back to that because I had a child a few years ago, and I think after you have children, I think they mess up your brain. So it takes me a while to realign my brain, and now I'm starting to write more. So yeah, so that's my story.
All right, very cool. The ADHD thing makes sense to me too, though I like to jump around to different projects myself as a writer, or even as a director or a filmmaker, producer sometimes too, and even with separate businesses altogether. But yeah, anyway. Um, let's talk about each one of your books. Would you tell me first about your fantasy novel with vampires, The Undead Sorceress?
So the Undead Sorceress is the very first novel I wrote, and the idea came after my grandmother had a stroke. So she was in her 90s, and she was in the hospital. And when she woke up, I told her, I was praying to, the gods and Buddha and everybody that maybe, because in the movies I always see this, right? Like when you take away years of your life and you give it to, whoever's sick, right? So I
Yeah.
was telling her about this, and then she was like, God, you're stupid. And she was like, I don't want this. And I was like, all right, all right. And then I started thinking, well, what if, grandmother could take away from my life and, make hers life longer. So that's sort of the idea for this book, is that this grandmother was asking her granddaughter, can you give me your life so I can live longer? And the granddaughter said yes, the main character, Tamara. But then it turns out she accidentally became a vampire. So because she's a vampire, she can't. So then instead of taking her life, the grandmother takes her great granddaughter's life, which is Tamara's daughter. So
Oh,
the whole book is sort of like a hero's quest of Tamara hunting down her grandma to save her
wow.
child. And so that was the journey, I guess, in the whole books. And in this book, because I'm a bit of a germaphobe, and also in a lot of Asian horror, they don't suck blood, the vampires. They suck chi energy, right?
Uh, and
Incorporate that into the book. I use a lot of Taoist stuff that I grew up with as well to sort of explain magic,
cool.
which kind of makes sense to me, I guess. So it's a whole system, and she learns magic, and she has to go after her grandmother and her sorceress friends and stuff like that. So that is the book. And it's supposed to be one. I think at first I thought about 1 in 5, but I'm sort of struggling with writing the second book. Because initially the second book I had a storyline where the vampire king dies, but then in real life my father passed, so then I couldn't do it. I was like, I wrote half of it and I was like, okay, I can't do this anymore. So now I'm changing the storyline. And
Oh,
anyhow, it's almost done, but it takes time. Writing is such a luxury, especially when I take care of so many people. My grandmother's still alive, she's 105. And it's kind of funny because when my dad fell sick, I was taking care of her because I was like, my dad's only in his 60s. He's not going to die first. But then, lo and behold, I think my grandma's just going to outlive all of us. But
something,
but
something in
anyhow,
here she needs, yeah.
But I mean, ever since I wrote this book, all the other things, the titles I have are mostly short stories,
Mhm.
because I just, uh, because I had a young child at the same time my dad fell sick, so I just couldn't pick myself up to do a novel again. So I was doing short stories because they were quicker, and there's more markets. Like it's so heartbreaking when you spend 3 4 years on this book and then you try to shop it around and then nobody wants it. Like, so for the Undead Sorceress, it took like 2 years to write and then another 2 years of shopping around, and everyone's telling me vampires are European. They're like, they're not Asian, so they couldn't. They're like, what's the marketing person's gonna do, right? Exactly. So I was like, oh, screw that. So then I decided to self-publish. I really didn't think about self-publishing in the beginning. It was just one of those things that happened. And it's a lot of work. I didn't realize how much work it was, to self-publish a book, actually, but
If
did
you don't
it.
mind going
So,
into that for just a second, because I know some in
hmm,
my audience are writers.
yeah.
Yeah. So why is self-publishing so much work in a nutshell? I mean, I know.
You do everything.
Yeah.
So if you think about, um, a house, like if you have a publisher, you can give them the architect drawings and they're like, okay. And then, they can build the house, they hire the contractors, they do everything. Although, mind you, you don't get much of the cut though at the
Yeah.
end, right? Because they're putting up so much money up front. But with self publishing, you're the one building the house. So you have to find people to help you do the work. And I think it's sort of a double-edged sword, right? Like some people spend a lot of time looking for a good editor, a good cover designer, et cetera, et cetera. And then others just publish it, without any editing, right?
Yeah.
So then I think that's part of why self-publishing had developed a bad rep in the beginning. But I think over time, you can see like some of the indie authors, their stuff is just as good as the publishers. I mean, they hire the same editors, the same PR teams, and
Mhm.
because I'm a deputy editor for Rice Paper Magazine, I get so many press releases. And then, sometimes I contact them and I'm like, can you come on my podcast? Let's talk about your book. And it turns out they self published the book, but you can't tell because the same press releases come from the same companies doing all the book promos, right? So it's kind of funny. Unless, you do, even if you look at their website, they also hire people. So it depends on the person that does the self publishing. So.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Could you tell me a little bit about your horror fantasy short story, The Blue Sun?
So the Blue Sun was a short story I wrote, which was inspired by a sea monster called the Kraken, which is a big blue octopus, and
Mhm.
also what I call my child. But anyhow, in this story, it's about a widow who was about to commit suicide when she heard this rattling noise. And it turns out her husband had left her a little kraken to take care of. So
Oh,
she starts raising this kraken, but then over time it becomes bigger and bigger, and she discovers that it needs a lot of food. So she starts walking around the neighborhood and she starts feeding it homeless people. So
oh,
I had based the story in Vancouver because I noticed when I visited there was a lot of homeless people, and I was thinking, if someone, really wants to knock people down and no one knows they're missing, like it's a good place to go.
yeah.
So I had shopped the story around for a little bit, and then I entered it into a short story contest, and I actually won. So, even if you have a short story and you shop it around, no one wants it, you never know. You just need one person to like it, right? So that's the basis of the short story. I mean, I'm not sure if I'll expand this one. I mean, it goes on a little bit longer because, she ages and she lives in a nursing home and stuff like that. So a lot of my stories, I think part of it is because I'm female, deals with a lot of caregiving stuff, which I don't see that much of in a lot of horror stories.
True enough. And you have another horror story in an anthology.
Hmm.
Sasang fans?
Yeah, it's the Sang fan. So Sasang, it's an obsessive stalker fan. So
Oh,
in the K-pop world, you have these girls that pretty much like they would quit school or they lie to their parents that they're at school and they would follow the K-pop stars everywhere. Like they would camp out in the coffee shops, they'll like figure out what flights they're on and book the same flight ticket so that they could sit in the same section. They'll like chase them down. I think the worst one, I think at one point, like one K-pop band was going into a van and they had swapped the van. So they hired another driver that had like a similar looking van so they could kidnap their idol. And it's a whole new level of
Yeah.
fan stalking, honestly.
Yeah.
Like when I was younger, I might wait outside the theater at, like, I remember waiting at the Elgin Theater, right, like after Phantom of the Opera for an autograph or
Yeah.
something. But like nothing like this. Like they will go after people in hotel rooms. Like yeah, so I was sort of inspired by this.
Cool.
So I actually did write a longer short story, which I still haven't published yet. But this one, Sasang fans, is a drabble. So the challenge was to write a story under 100 words. And I think writing really short stories is really, it's harder than writing a long story because your word count is so limited
Mhm.
and you're trying to say so much. So in this piece, it's about a K-pop star meeting his fans and being torn apart, pretty much. And it's in an anthology called 666, and it's a great cover. It has a picture of the stuffed rabbit on a noose. I don't know, it just looks so. And it's published by Black Hair Press, which is an Australian indie publishing company. So
Nice.
uh, so that one's pretty cool. So,
Yeah, yeah. And one more short story, if you
mhm.
would. My Girl. Tell me about that.
So My Girl, I wrote this for Sirens e-sign. It was a Woman in Horror Month issue.
Okay.
And this story is about a woman who knows she's about to miscarry.
Oh,
So she wants to save her baby, but the doctor told her the baby's dead, right? So she visits a Chinese witch, and the witch is like, sure, of course, we can save this baby, but you just have to find another baby to swap the life, right? I'm so obsessed with ghost babies, so I'll probably write more ghost babies. So besides, because her best friend has a bunch of kids and they're poorer than her, she's like, okay, so she tricks her best friend into sort of swapping. And then I guess the moment of conflict is like, should she continue, right? Like if you know you're gonna do this, right, and this is your best friend, like would you still want to uh you know because you want something so badly sometimes, right? And part of it was inspired because I was going to fertility clinics for many years, and sometimes you see a woman bring in a child, right, because they're trying for their second, and
okay.
you see all the women in the room just look at that child, like, you know what I mean, like you can't help it, right, because you're like,
Yeah,
you want your own, and then you see this one trying for their second and you're like, damn it, I just want one, right?
yeah. Oh,
And I totally understand like why someone would do this.
mhm.
So that was how I came about like writing the story. So
Right. Wow. Very cool, very inventive, and obviously very much out of your own life experience too. I mean, with a lot
yeah,
of magic thrown in there.
yeah,
You know,
you know,
I doubt you have much experience with actual krakens, so
yeah,
I'm hoping.
I know, eh? Not yet.
Very cool, though. All right. Well, now we'll get into what you mentioned before here. Why do you like writing in the horror genre? And also, what do you like about mixing fantasy with horror?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons why I like writing horror is none of my friends and family read it, so I can make up stuff about them. No, but also, I think in both horror and fantasy, it's a safe place to sort of write about things
Mhm.
and explore issues that sometimes it's really hard to talk about in real life. Like when you tell someone something, they might not necessarily listen, but you say it in a story, maybe they're more likely to think about it later and investigate the issue themselves.
Mhm.
And I was sort of reading an article about J.R.R. Tolkien, and he was talking about how when you write, you're building your world building, you're doing a sub creation. Like he was very religious, so he's thinking about God and how God created him, and then he created all these worlds, right? So in a way, when you write a story, you are creating this world with this character, and thinking about all the moral issues and all the values that this character has, and what would they do. So you can explore all these different storylines in a safe space, and you don't have to necessarily agree with the character, but so you can sort of do all these different things. It's a playground, really, I think, for both fantasy and horror. And also I think for horror, I mean, I grew up reading horror, but I noticed a lot of it was very exploitive in a way. Like most of the time, the females are the victims and
Mhm.
very gory, and then I sort of got bored with that actually quite quickly, like a lot of the American horror.
Mhm.
So I noticed, well, my parents accidentally introduced me to Asian horror because back in the day when they had the VHS tapes, right? It was like, was it 8 hours, 12 hours? So in the beginning there were kids shows, and then towards the end, their friend would throw in like a horror movie, And then I think I remember being like still in a playpen and I'm just like, Mom, but nobody came because, the VHS tape was supposed to be my babysitter. And I was
Yeah.
just, from an early age, I was accidentally exposed to horror movies. And then I think I got desensitized after that, like
Yeah,
after
that
you see that and you're so horrified and then you get over it. And then you're like, oh, okay, well, I guess that was a bit interesting. So, but when I write, I like to write about things I know, right? Like, and I'm a caregiver, so I feel like a lot of stories don't really have that aspect. I don't know if it's because people don't care or maybe they don't find it interesting. I don't know. So I like to put a spin on things and write about things that matter to me, right? So
yeah, which is absolutely what every writer should do within what their own experience. But in your case, you're filling a niche. It seems that is not being filled otherwise, which is really great. So
well, like when I was growing up, I really wanted to see more, I guess, Asian like East meets West horror. I think that's what I term my own stuff, is East meets West horror, because I grew up here, but I also watch a lot of Asian stuff. I watch a lot of English stuff. And then in the English stuff, I didn't see any Asian people. And then in the Asian stuff, I swear, I think sometimes they just grab a actor off the street that's white and then make them say lines, because they're always the worst actors being Dracula or whatever. And I'm like, seriously? You couldn't even cast Dracula properly? And it was just, it's a different world. So,
it's funny though. It's very interesting.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. But
Cool.
yeah, I mean, initially, I did start off normal, I guess. I mean, because when I was growing up, there wasn't much money. So, but one teacher thought I was deaf and dumb because I didn't even know my English name. Because at home we only spoke Chinese, right? My grandmother raised us, and then my mom actually has an English degree, and she's like, "What's wrong with these people?" So they started like force feeding me English stuff. So suddenly I was watching Star Trek, and like I could read whatever I wanted. So I was reading a lot of, the Sweet Valley Highs, the Babysitter Club. And then eventually when they weren't noticing, somehow I slipped into like Stephen King and Clive Barker and Anne Rice. So my parents were supportive, but they didn't really realize what I was reading. I mean, they're like, oh, it's in English. It's good. Like she needs to learn English, right? And I remember actually one time Anne Rice came to Toronto and I so wanted to see her. But my mom was like, no, you have class. It's the middle of the afternoon. So she went and she got me Anne Rice autograph. And she's like, I don't know why you want this autograph from this like woman that looks like a corpse. And I was like, oh my God.
Was this when she was dressed like a black not like her dress was black and she was a bride, like dressed in black?
This was in her Vampire Lestat days. It was a while ago.
Yeah, because when I believe I was in university, I went to a site, like she was nearby, like downtown, right, Toronto, and yeah, so I did actually get her to sign a book, but it was Memnoch the Devil, I think.
Oh, okay.
Right around when she was back in Toronto for that. So because I don't think she's been to Toronto tons of times, but yeah. Okay, I was just curious. Was it the same one?
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Very cool, but I'm sorry you did. Your mom decided to go instead.
That's she was like, "You're not going," and and that's it. So whatever.
You got the autograph?
Yeah, I got the autograph. So it's okay.
Why particularly do you like to blend horror and fantasy, though? Those two things.
Well, I don't know. To me, I don't think about like borders that much. You know what I mean? Like when I write, I just write. And like people, and I think it's very mixed these days. Like people talk about speculative fiction, they talk about urban fantasy. Like I don't know if you can really separate things as much anymore. But I guess
crossing everything.
I think everything is a bit cross, but I guess the horror is more associated with the death stuff, right? Like, usually there's a bit more a morbidness to it. And the fantasy, like, it's kind of funny. I have to think about it a bit more because someone asked me to write a high fantasy story, and I'm like, high fantasy. So I have to look that up. I was like, what do they mean? And they're like, oh, with trolls and orcs.
Yeah, they mean like
wizards
and Hobbit, like Tolkien, basically is that kind of high fantasy. maybe even C.S. Lewis and stuff like that. So I think
Yeah, stuff
maybe
like that. So I wrote something. I
dragons.
haven't heard back whether or not it was all right, but I think it's, I mean, I think I'd say I write mostly maybe speculative fiction. I say just mix it all together, call
Yeah,
it a day. It's easier. Although
yeah.
sometimes I have to explain it because then people are like, what is speculative? I was like, sci-fi, horror, fantasy, whatever, everything. So
Push it all together. Yeah, anything that is speculative, really,
yeah.
relatively. I
Oh,
think the word works well to describe what it means, but it covers most bases.
books. So I
Sure,
could talk about books I've edited.
sure.
So one speculative fiction book we call it is Immersion. So that was an Asian speculative fiction book.
Right.
But actually, when you look at the cover, it actually looks more like a horror book because the artist chose to illustrate one of the stories about a snow queen that kills people. So it's kind of but it's a very striking cover. So for that one, we wanted to gather Asian speculative stories, and the Asian writing community isn't that big, so it was kind of like pulling teeth,
Mhm.
trying to get people to send stuff in. Like when you have a call for submission, like I think maybe we got what 60, and we chose 12 or 13.
Mhm.
Like it was not like it's not like hundreds and hundreds of stuff, right?
Yeah.
Um, and then another book I worked on is the Trump Utopia or Dystopia book. So that book happened after he was elected, and just around then my dad died, and I remember being really upset because my dad died, and then this
Yeah.
guy's here. So I was like, okay, I have to channel my anger. So then I opened up a submission call for stories. And then around then, it was also heading into Canada's 150th. So then I did two submission calls. Another one was called Futuristic Canada. So I wanted sci-fi stories about Canada. Oh my God, no one wanted to write about Canada. I had to like beg people that I knew. I was like, can you please send me some stories about Canada? Like it was pretty sad. But then for Trump, I got like over 100 stories. Like people really liked writing about him.
Well, they
So
need to
that was
get
very
that out,
interesting.
right? Just like what
Yeah.
while.
And actually, like right now, I'm finishing editing another book. So one of the stories that made it is by a science fiction feminist scholar in the States called Marlene Barr,
Mhm.
and she says she doesn't like Trump, but this is the second book she's put together about him, and so I was like, okay, so I'll be publishing that. We're looking at October, November, but I don't really read. I have to admit, I don't read much feminist fiction, but it's kind of an angry book where he dies a lot and aliens take him away and stuff like that. So it's just different projects. So yeah.
Yeah, that could be very cathartic to read too.
Well, off he goes again. And she was like, the planet ovarium or, the
Oh,
fallopian tube, whatever. So yeah,
oh no,
very,
but hey, it's very deserving now. Yeah, that to like women feminism exacting revenge kind of thing sounds
yes,
kind
pretty
of
much.
cool, actually. All right. Do you have anything, especially horror wise, yourself in the pipes that you're working on, even just mentally?
Yeah, I'm actually finishing up another novel. This one, I think I'm calling it Ghost Brides. So I don't, in some, I guess there's a custom where, if someone dies, sometimes, well, I guess if your family's poor, they might sell you. I mean, I'm talking about women, right? And then you become a ghost bride, right? Like you'll be marrying someone that's already passed.
Right.
So I was thinking of, so I had actually written a short story. It hasn't been published yet, but basically it's about demon hunting in San Francisco in the 1800s, and this is after the railway has been finished,
Mhm.
and after the gold rush.
Right.
And the story is about two sisters, and they're sold by their father, who's a gambler, to become mujai, which is like domestic servants slash slaves, back in the day.
Yeah.
And they are sent on a ship to come to Gumsan or to go to San Francisco, right?
Mhm.
Because back then, oh my gosh, the ratio was crazy. It's like 10 men to one woman. Like Chinatown was just men, period.
Yeah.
So, because they didn't want, the Chinese people to stay, right? They just want them to just build a railroad and get out, but that didn't happen. So on board the ship, these two sisters are chosen to become ghost brides and they're tossed overboard. So the story is about the journey of the elder sister and how she survives being tossed overboard. She makes it to America, and then sort of ends up in a convent, and sort of so she's trying to find her sister, but apparently there's also these demons. Well, I call it yokai. Yokai is like, it's like an all-encompassing word I use just for supernatural stuff. It's a
Mhm.
Japanese word, and but they're the equivalent of demons the in the West. So she's like hunting these monsters and trying to figure out what the heck's going on. So yeah, so that's the book I'm finishing up. And then I know there's like there's always publishers wanting manuscripts. So probably try shopping it around after this and see if it goes anywhere. But I guess it's a horror slash
Oh yeah.
fantasy. So yeah.
So yeah, a little bit paranormal in there, and yeah, that sounds super cool. Frankly, so I would read it.
Okay, I'll send you a copy when it's ready.
Awesome, and I'll have to check in with you about it, see how it goes. Because yeah, no, I want to read it now. So yeah, it has to be published. So
Yeah.
get on
Have
that.
to get through that first.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.